Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Welcome to our webinar. Today we're talking about using storytelling and a strong business case to get your project approved. A couple things before we get started. There is a Q&A at the end of this session, so you will see a send message link at the top of your screen, and if you'd like to send a question throughout the presentation anytime, just use that link and you'll be able to send it directly to me, and I'll make sure it gets directed to our speaker at the end of the event. Another thing is we will be sending out a post-event recording probably tomorrow or end of the week, so you can review this again if you like. So you can expect that in your email as a follow-up. And other than that, we are ready to go, so we'll get started. The objective of this webinar is to give you some of the components to build out a strong business case, and then use proven storytelling methodologies to be able to get your project approved by presenting it well and effectively. Speaking for us today, we have Smart Action's CEO, Tom Lewis. And Tom's a former Deloitte partner leading the call center advisory practice, has over 25 years in contact center customer experience. So he's an expert in the subject matter. And he is going to kick off. And again, please enter your questions in the send message link at the top of the screen throughout the presentation if you have anything you'd like to ask him at the end of this. Tom, over to you.
Fantastic. So as Kim indicated, part of this session is really designed to help you position a project that you may be trying to get approved. Now, this could apply to any aspect of a business, but given sort of probably the reason you attended this conference or this webinar is around the call center, I'm going to focus my comments around that. And I'm going to use several different storytelling methodologies. It's going to be more of a logical overview, but then we'll get into some of the costs and some of the positioning and stakeholder management and things like that. So I think it'll be a good mashup of ideas. This is sort of an encore presentation from the 3-hour workshop that I conducted last week at Call Center Week in New Orleans, and that went over very well, and so we decided to condense it down to probably about 30 minutes and go over it here. So the very first storytelling methodology I want to discuss is the SIR model, or the Situation Impact Resolution. Now, I take no credit for this. This is a product of Gartner. For those of you that are Gartner members, can download that most of the information around this from them. But the idea is, with an outcome in mind, as you tell a story, think about it in terms of setting up the situation, i.e. describing what the current state is very often, or what the problem is, and then evolving that story into what is the impact or the consequences of that situation, and following up with, okay, now here's the resolution. Now, many of you have sat in conferences where, people will come up or stand up and they'll tell the story, they'll tell a particular situation that they're running into, and sometimes they organically or naturally use this methodology, and it flows very well because you can pay attention to it. Other times it's sort of a random. They start with what they did first, to solve it, and then they sort of back up and so forth. And so part of the reason why this works, I think, is, and all the storytelling methodologies are predicated on this, is that the human psyche is developed from this idea thousands of years ago that information was actually transferred from person to person over generation to generation through storytelling. So we are hardwired to not only tell stories, but also hardwired to listen, receive, etc. So the reason that this is useful in the whole getting a business case approved is because as you go through the stakeholder management, as you go through the presentations, as you go through the sort of preaching, if you will, what it is you want to get accomplished, this is a very good methodology to do that. So I want to use a very specific example. So on the next slide, now, you ever have one of those days, or maybe sort of a situation where you've been telling this story for so long, you don't even remember whether it's true or not? Well, this is one of those stories. So while I have Dell's logo up here, please forgive me. I actually don't even know if this story is true or not. But it's a good story just the same. So hopefully you'll forgive me. So there was a problem with Dell's website early on, let's say this is 20 years ago. Now, you may remember Michael Dell started his computer hardware business in his dorm room, and they used mail order catalogs, and then it sort of evolved from there, obviously, as the Internet came along and so forth. And so what was happening was people were trying to purchase online a configured PC and were having trouble. The website had bugs in it. And so what would happen is people would start on the website, and then they'd pick up the phone and call the call center. Well, the natural implication of that is that the reason that you have the website is to reduce costs in the call center, but now all of a sudden people were going into the call center. And it was compounded by the fact that the call center representatives were actually commissioned based on being able to sell a PC. And so they liked the fact that all these calls were coming in because these weren't even sales activities. These were almost order taking, and so it was easy money. But it meant that the costs went up high. So the impact of that was that even though the website was being developed, it wasn't achieving its return on investment, and the costs overall were going up. And so what Dell decided to do was they took a portion of the reps on the phone and made them use the same website that the callers were using. And the idea was that if there was a defect in the website that caused the agents not to be able to complete the transaction, the IT folks would know about it immediately because they couldn't get their commission without the website working. And so that was a forcing mechanism that solved that problem. Now, let's go through the components of this thing in the storytelling methodology. So the outcome was that Dell wanted to streamline this process. They want to save money, improve the customer experience, all the things that I think all of us are trying to do in the call center space. But the problem was, or the situation was, there's a broken website. And so the impact of that was actually higher cost of sales, poor website experience, probably several other things you could add to that list. And the resolution was that they made the call center use the same website. So this is an example of using the SIR methodology or the situation impact resolution methodology to tell a story. So I'm going to do another one similar to this, but I'm going to use a different framework entirely. And this one is ATA, which is America Transair. It was a low-fare carrier, and as Kim indicated, I was a partner at Deloitte a long time ago. Actually, it seems like a long time ago. It was only about 3.5 years ago. But ATA was a client of mine a very long time ago. And they had hired me to help assess what the costs were of their call center and how to improve it. Now, ATA being a low-cost air carrier at the time, there were lots of other carriers, not only Southwest, but also you remember the mainline carriers like United had TED and Delta had Song, and then there was Independence Air, and there was, just all these low-fare carriers, and it seemed like that's where the airline industry was going. So let's say there was 10 of them. And the client said, I need to figure out where we fit on the curve or the ranking in terms of lowest cost operation for our call centers. Now, one of the problems as a consultant is I wasn't an analyst, I was a consultant. I didn't have the data for the other 9 call centers, for these other 9 carriers. So I engaged, my client was actually the CFO, and I engaged him in a dialogue that said, okay, imagine if I could tell you what the costs in operations and where you fit. And I found out that you are actually the worst. Of the 10, you have the worst operation, you have the worst cost, you have the worst everything. What would you do about it? And so we had a very healthy discussion for about 45 minutes and came up with a list of 5 main things. And I said, okay, so that's a good list. Now, imagine I came back to you, and instead of telling you that you're the worst, you're actually the best at that particular, in terms of costs and customer experience. I said, what would you do with that information? He said, well, actually, I think we still need to do the 5 things that we talked about. I said, okay, great. Well, let's go do those 5 things instead of doing this benchmarking study. Now, I often use that story to convince somebody that they already know the answer to something and that the use of benchmarking is in some cases is useful. Don't get me wrong. Definitely think in some cases useful. In other cases, it's just reaffirming something that you already know and often is a delay and sort of a preponderance of caution. So This story, hopefully that was engaging and you heard the whole story, follows a slightly different methodology, and it's FREYTAG'S pyramid. So if you think about this methodology, it goes through an Act 1, which is exposing the initial moment. The problem is the client wants to reduce the costs. There's this complication, which is I don't have the data. And so we then say, all right, well, let's have a discussion around the 5 things that you should improve on. And so that was a good discussion. Then we change the cards, change the table, whatever, and come up with this scenario that, well, no, actually you're the best, so what would you do? And so the denouement basically in this case is the final act or the final conclusion, which is, well, if we already know what to do, let's just go do it. And so the next slide actually walks through these same components, but I wanted to sort of do it on that pyramid so that you could see how those pieces came together. If nothing else out of this discussion, hopefully you've gotten some context in terms of how to frame stories, understanding that you're trying to defend a point of view or postulate a particular recommendation, and that there's the data, there's the recommendation, there's the pieces of the puzzle, but there's also how you deliver it. And so later on we're going to take a little bit more time to talk about the how you deliver it piece. But what I'd like to do now is talk about some of the building blocks for the actual business case itself. Not surprisingly, there are a number of components to a typical business case. And we're not going to go super deep today, although there is an encore presentation, or not a follow-up presentation that sort of peels the onion back a little bit farther. But this will be good. This is sort of the prerequisite for that. And the first thing is that for technology being presented in the call center, every vendor presenting a solution should do so with the expectation that the client has the expectation that the solution is going to reduce costs and improve customer experience. In today's world, that is table stakes for any kind of technology. You should be able to reduce costs and improve customer experience. The what else on here is, therefore, what is the differentiator that you bring to the table? And in defining an ROI for whether it's for the vendor or for your project internally, the point is that the expectations internally are very high, that you have these benefits, but then that what's the what else? So we'll talk about these things. But before I move on, there's two thoughts. One is, you notice I don't have revenue on here. Some organizations, this entire thing is about revenue. In my consulting experience, I would say 80% of all projects I did were really revolving around cost reduction. There was a heavy overlap, maybe another 15% plus overlap on customer experience, and a very, very small percentage left over that was around revenue, just pure revenue generation. That may be entirely different and flipped and opposite in your organization, but just as a sort of a canvas, these are the things that were typically the most important. So to talk about the cost before we move on, what I'd like you to do is think in your mind, if you're talking about a call center operation, there are a lot of costs that factor in. But what's the number one cost inside a call center? And you're probably all nodding your head and saying, well, of course, it's the labor. And certainly it is the labor inside of a call center. And so very often when people engage in this discussion around cost savings and headcount reduction, if those two things go in the same conversation. In fact, I had one client who wanted to literally remove millions and millions of dollars of costs in their call center operation. And we went through a strategy and had an interesting discussion with them. This is back in my consulting days. And I made the erroneous assumption that they wanted to reduce the cost because that's what they hired me for, but they indicated that they would not be laying anybody off. And that's where most of your costs are. So it's an interesting dichotomy in terms of where your costs are going to come from. Now, they can come from lots of other places as well, but it's just a question of whether it'll have the impact that you're looking for in terms of amount of cost reduction. But if I said all it's going to do, let's say, just to keep it simple, is to reduce the headcount by 1 FTE. And somebody looking at that would say, well, we pay an FTE this much, and so therefore the number of calls they take in an hour is that much, and so the cost per call associated with that, et cetera, is, let's say they make $15 an hour, and they take 15 calls in an hour, and so every call is $1 a call. Well, That's how a lot of executives that don't work in the call center will think about the cost equation. And the reason is it's actually sort of surprising that there's a lot of nomenclature, processes, et cetera, in the call center arena where executives that aren't responsible for the call center don't fully understand. So a big part of demonstrating value, pitching your idea, building the ROI, et cetera, may also include a decent amount of education. So, for example, the cost per call is not the number of calls an agent takes. In fact, on this next slide, what you have to factor in, and if you've been in the call center for a very long time, you know this already, is there's all these other costs in order to support that individual agent. You have quality team, somebody who's doing quality monitoring and doing QA on your calls, and you have people who do that on a sampling basis. Whether that's a supervisor or a special dedicated team, that's one. I'm going to walk around this diagram, and I'm actually going to drain it a little bit in clockwise. Equipment, obviously, if there's equipment that is specifically used, whether it's headphones, PCs, et cetera, that won't be needed if you get rid of a significant portion of agents, then there's savings associated with that, whether it's cost, whether they're rented or what have you. You certainly have the hourly rate or the salaries associated with it, but then you also have a portion of the supervisor time. You have recruiting expense, and one of the biggest things that we find today is how hard it is to retain agents, even harder than it was, 5, 10 years ago. And so the recruiting expenses seem to creep up. And what's not on this slide are all of the consequences of not having, or of recruiting and the impact on customer experience, error rates, fraud, et cetera, by virtue of the fact that you have higher turnovers. And so those are all sorts of other costs that are associated with turnover, which if you don't have to hire as many people because you've got a headcount reduction, you actually have sort of a supercharger on the recruiting side of it. Occupancy rates overall impact your ability to have effective sort of cost per call. Software licenses, I think, probably fits in the same category as equipment. Certainly have training. How long does it take to get a new employee up to speed, as well as training them for as processes change, those kind of things. And then standard things like benefits, whether that's a combination of taxes as well as health care insurance or other benefits that you provide your employees. And then finally, workforce management, the team required to make sure that you have the right bodies in the right place at the right time. If you add up all these costs, it can get to a very complicated formula to try to figure out, well, hang on a second, what is my cost per call? And therefore, if I'm saving so many calls, let's say through automation, through a new IVR, what is my savings? And so the easiest way to do this is to take your budget overall and strip out things that would be permanent, whether you had a whole bunch of agents or not, like the building, for example, unless you're literally going to get rid of buildings in the process, which would be, sort of a very impressive cost reduction. But let's leave that out of the equation. You take your budget overall that includes all these things, and if you divide it by the number of calls you take during that budget period, that's your cost per call. Not $1, not the $15 divided by 15 calls equals $1, but rather your entire budget divided by all of the calls gives you your cost per call. Now, as I mentioned at the top, I conducted this as a workshop for 3 hours, and when I got to this slide, before I really got into the details, I asked people to raise their hand if their cost per call was in the $2 to $3 range or greater. Everyone in the room raised their hand. And then I sort of walked up the chain and said, what about $4? What about $5? I was shocked. I got all the way up to $10, and I said, all right, that's enough. And not everybody in the room had their hand up. But I was surprised at the number of people that were having $10 cost per call. Now, obviously, that varies widely from company to company, business practice to business practice, and so your results may vary, as they like to say. But my point being that it's usually not the buck a call that you might have been thinking about. So let's move on and talk about some of the other broad costs and the way to think about this. So first is that from an ROI perspective, return on investment, there has to be both the costs and the benefits associated with whatever it is you're trying to implement. And from an ROI model, you need to know what your current costs are. So that's why I started with the cost per call. That's a good proxy to make a comparison, particularly if whatever technology you're implementing is going to have an impact on, let's say, average handle time or overall call volume or what have you. And the other piece is the opportunity costs. People often underestimate the opportunity cost associated with the decisions that they plan to make inside the business. Now, sometimes those decisions are made for them because, let's say, there's insufficient IT resources or other resources or budget or what have you. But there's a whole lot of opportunity cost discussion that probably should be had. So, for example, if one solution you have offers the ability to go live or to start using the solution in, say, 3 months because it's a cloud solution and it's well-oiled and so forth, versus one that you build yourself and takes a year to go live. The opportunity cost in that example is the difference between the 3 months where you start getting the benefits in 3 months versus the project where you go live in 1 year. There's 9 months worth of opportunity costs associated with that, and you have to factor that in. Again, this is something that we're going to dive a little bit deeper into when we do next month's webinar. So let's talk about getting buy-in and stakeholder management and the impacts on customer experience, et cetera. So from a customer experience perspective, the way to measure it is through a variety of different systems. One, 25, 30 years ago was around CSAT, customer satisfaction surveys. Everybody does those, and they do them in different ways. In fact, they're all just sort of generically referred to as lots of questions on a 5 or 10-point scale. And then maybe a while ago, again, 20 years ago, the introduction of NPS, or Net Promoter Score, simply asking the question, would you recommend? Started in the insurance industry, but has become very prolific. The latest recommended measure is CES, or Customer Effort Score. Similar to NPS, it asks one question, and the question is, was it easy to do what you wanted to do? This could revolve around talking to an agent, or it could be self-service. It could be in the IVR, or it could be web self-service, it could be chat, it could be anything. The idea is, was it easy? And the notion behind this, and by the way, Customer Effort Score comes from corporate executive boards. Well, it probably comes from lots of places, but the source that we like to refer to is the Corporate Executives Board book called The Effortless Experience by Matt Dixon. Talks largely about automating lots of things through the website and whatnot. I think it's probably 2012 at this point, getting a few years ago. But the idea is that it's a better predictor of your future behavior of your customers if their perception was that it was easy to do what they wanted to get done. Very often, one way to think about self-service or just contact in general from customers is this notion that customers choose the channel that they choose to interact with you based on which one they think is going to take the least amount of effort to get the task done. So if you think about that for a second, if they think that calling you and talking to a human on the phone is the least amount of effort to get the task done, that might speak volumes around the rest of your business. Now, on the other hand, it may be that your business is so complex that that's justified. In other cases, it may mean that you have a long way to go in terms of self-service capabilities and opportunities. And then, as I gave the example earlier around the 3 months versus 1 year project, you also have an opportunity cost in that, but also in the cost of doing nothing. And that cost of doing nothing from a customer experience perspective is often revolves around what your competitors are doing. One of my favorite stories in my consulting days was I would go into a utility, public utility or otherwise, and they would tell me their performance relative to the J.D. Powers Awards. And they'd show me all of these different companies that were on this list that they competed against and that they were the top of the J.D. Powers for the Northeast region, for example. And the problem with that is that they're comparing themselves against other utilities when, in fact, the consumers of that energy, the consumers of the business, the consumers who are interacting with those businesses have other baselines. They have an experience of going into an Apple store. They have the experience of dealing with their bank and doing everything online. And so while as a comparative against other utilities, they may get a J.D. Powers Award, comparative against other industries, they'd probably be dead last. And so the cost of doing nothing is not only cross-industry and setting expectations and so forth from a customer experience perspective, but it's also the cost of and the impact to your customer base associated with what your competition is doing. And never in my entire 20-some-odd years in the call center industry have I seen the advancement in technology move at the pace at which it is moving today. And it's not only that the pace is moving fast, but that it's yielding a significant amount of confusion and sort of fear inside of call center managers' minds, because there's always been optimizing the call center. You can do labor arbitrage, you can do process improvement, you have these sort of the tools in your toolbox. And now all of a sudden, the game pieces are sort of moving around a little bit. You have customers expecting you to have an omni-channel solution. They expect you to have bots via voice and bots via chat. They expect you to be open 24/7. They expect the website to be doing all sorts of things. And so the cost of doing nothing is actually getting greater at the same time that the pace of change and improvements in technology is growing as well. So I'd like to hit the last major section in the presentation here, and that is really getting buy-in from your audience. And actually, this revolves around the what else comment that I made earlier on. So if you are trying to implement something in your call center, let's say it's workforce management, it's quality monitoring, it's an IVR, whatever it is, the question is, did it get approved, or is it going to get approved? Well, there's a budgeting process, no doubt. And the question is, does your project get above or below the line? The line being the things above the line got approved, the things below the line did not get approved. And very often, call center projects, for whatever reason, back to maybe what I said earlier about the executives not being fully aware of what you're doing in the call center and having a full appreciation for it, call center projects so often fall below the line. But I believe that there's a fundamental reason for it. And the fundamental reason is that there's a lack of strategic alignment between what you're trying to do and what the corner office is trying to do. Now, when I say corner office, I'm just using that as a proxy to somebody who's running some portion of the business who has some level of authority or ability to approve budget for your project. And so we had a client at Smart Action who was a trucking company, as an example, and they had lots of reasons why they wanted to implement technology. But strangely enough, one of the key reasons was they wanted to reduce risk. They wanted to make sure that the truck drivers who were calling in for various reasons did not have to push buttons on their phone. So they wanted a voice-enabled solution. Well, if you're just trying to save costs or you're trying to improve customer experience, those are good things. But if the corner office wants to reduce risk, the question is, what technology, what processes can you in the call center introduce to help reduce that risk? Now, risk is only one example. There are many organizations who, whether they're healthcare, they want to improve the HIPAA compliance aspects of their business. And if they're dealing with financial transactions, they may want to reduce fraud. If they're a retailer, they may want to improve the number of inventory turns in the warehouse. You may say, well, holy cow, how can this technology have anything to do with that piece? Well, what I would challenge you is to understand what are those strategic objectives outside of the call center. What are the strategic objectives of the business? And how then you're in a position to be able to answer the question of, well, how does what I'm doing in the call center align with that? And sometimes it's a straight line, and sometimes it's a little curvy, but the idea is you can help contribute to meeting the management by objectives, the goals, et cetera, of the senior leadership. Now, again, when I did this as a workshop, I was fascinated to find there were several people in the audience who actually really did not know the answer to this question. What are the strategic objectives of the corner office? And I said, well, that's telling in itself. You're going to have a hard time getting your budgets approved if there's not an alignment between the corner office, again, I'm using that as a proxy, and what it is you're trying to achieve. So assuming that you understand what that is, what the what else is, then beyond that, you also have some more work to do to get your project above the line. So let's talk about putting this whole story, this whole thing together. So the first piece is that you have sort of the storytelling. Now, what's ironic is, as a way we presented this, storytelling is actually last. But I used it first to try to set up the context for the presentation. The fact is, you can't tell a story if you don't know what you're going to recommend and don't have the facts and all that kind of stuff and don't have a strong business case. So the two go together. What your audience is going to see is how it's packaged. So how it's packaged is not only the numbers and the data and the position and so forth, it's also how you present it to the stakeholders. And the stakeholders are going to constantly be asking the question, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? What's in it for my department? What's in it for whatever? And the fact is that there are lots of stakeholders that are part of this discussion. The number of people that are involved in a stakeholder discussion around call center technology is a little mind-boggling, actually. You have, obviously, the call center. You have IT. You might have finance. You might have procurement. You might have marketing. You probably have the business, whatever that means in your organization. You have legal. The list goes on. And so what often happens is these business cases are developed and then sort of presented in committee. And the comment I would make is that there's definitely an important stakeholder management exercise here. First of all, do you know who all of those different pieces and parts of all those people are? Can you credibly answer the question, what's in it for them? And therefore, have you sort of prepared what their position is? And the best way to do that is to ask them. Have one-on-one discussions with these stakeholders and say, if we're, whatever starting position you may take, listening to them around what it is they're trying to achieve and how what you're doing is going to impact them is a big part of it. And so in my consulting days, it was clearly the best practice to have the discussion with the individuals so that when you are in the conference room and presenting the overall solution, assuming that's the format that things take, that the individuals in the room were often the ones actually presenting and helping to present on your behalf, as opposed to you trying to sort of shove it down everybody's throats, as it were. Much better to manage these individually. So with that, I went about 3 or 4 minutes longer than I wanted to, but hopefully that was useful information. I want to thank you guys very much. And I'm curious, Kim, if during any of that there were any questions that I could answer before we talk about the next webinar coming up next month.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So we did get a couple questions that I'll send over to you. They are very aligned with a lot of the stuff that you just talked about, so your opinion will come in handy. One of the things that you touched on last was strategic objectives. So we got a question about what do we do if we don't know the strategic objectives of the corner office?
The simple answer, of course, is go find out. That may be too simplistic. I think it raises, and it may be one of those things where you have to sort of ratchet up. So you start with where you are, and you go to your boss, and then your boss may go to the next boss. But it raises an interesting communication and dynamic inside the organization. But there also, in some cases, it may be, no, that's actually very well known. You're just not in tune to it. And so need to be careful to make sure that if the direction is being given in, let's say, quarterly reports from management or, updates via newsletters or emails or things like that, all that information is probably in there at the macro level and probably at the level that you need to at least start the conversation. But to dive deeper to understand what some of the tactics are, so the example I used where risk for the truck drivers, that may or may not have come out in that material. And so that really requires a dialogue at that level.
Great. How do you convince upper management if you have all the information, everything's going well, but they're still concerned, they're trying to be cost effective?
Yeah, so there's this balance between what you want to do, the risks associated with doing it. In some cases, it's the cost effectiveness of it. In some cases, it could be the exposure that particular solution could offer. So, for example, if the solution's a great idea, everybody thinks so, but they're a very conservative organization and are concerned what customers will really have to say or react to it. And that all depends on the culture inside of an organization. Some are very, very conservative and slow from that standpoint, want to try out everything, and that's reasonable. In other cases, it may make sense to do piloting and trying and so forth. And you have opportunity costs associated with a pilot, or a proof of concept or whatever, other strategy. It's the classic dipping your toe in the water. Although one of the clients I used, that used to make a statement that I liked, was that they called it the two-canoe strategy. And what they were trying to say is, have you ever tried to stand up with one foot in one canoe and another foot in another canoe? That's a very hard thing to do, especially as those canoes start to separate from each other. And so at some point you have to sort of make a decision and go with it, because you're never going to be successful straddling the fence or doing the two-canoe strategy.
One last question, which is a hard one. If everyone in the organization is already on board, project approved, but still can't get IT resources, any suggestions?
IT resource and IT constraints is very often the number one challenge for organization, and to try to solve that from sideways or the bottom or what have you in the call center operation can be extremely difficult. There's it's like the classic expression, it's not the problem, it's your attitude towards the problem. Well, think of it a different way. It's not that IT doesn't have resources, it's that they, in many cases, don't have the time to figure out how many resources they need. And in some cases, once they've done that, the resources they need might actually be fairly minimal, particularly if the vendor is prepared to do a lot of the heavy lifting themselves, or perhaps are qualified and, it's a budget issue versus a resource issue. And so understanding where IT's pinch point is it that we can't get to this project, or that we don't have an adequate or accurate assessment of what the effort really is? And I would argue that at least 50% of the time it's actually the first problem and not the second.
Perfect. Well, that is all the questions. So thank you, Tom.
Sure.
And then for the audience, just another reminder, Tom mentioned that we will be doing another webinar next month, which is a deeper dive into figuring out the actual true cost of the technology and then the benefit associated. And Tom touched on it a little bit, but this is really breaking down that component of the business plan and spelling it out so it makes it easier for you guys to actually put it down to your true objectives in your business. So you will, if you're on this webinar, you will receive the invitation in the mail. You don't have to do anything. And you will also receive a recording of this presentation afterwards as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next month.